The Big Short. Summary. The Big Short explains how three different groups of investors, Michael Burry, Mark Baum, and two young investors named Jamie Shipley and Charlie Geller, made a ton of money off of shorting the whole housing market in 2008. The movie displays many ethical issues in the banking and rating industries that led to this disaster. Ultimately, the movie talks about how these three investors shorted the housing market and profited off the crisis. There was a lot of corruption between mortgage-backed securities, CDOs, and the rating agencies. The banking industry was looking out for the best interests of the banks and not for their shareholders. Introduction. This movie had numerous amount of ethical issues that were extremely prevalent to the reading that we've discussed in class. Unfortunately, these ethical decisions might have helped individuals in the short run, but ended up tanking the entire global economy. Millions of people lost their jobs because of these unethical behaviors. Many of these behaviors have arisen from our culture of Wall Street and big banks. The situations that occurred are very similar to the topics brought up in Chapter 13, which discusses who runs a corporation and oversees it. If men's were angels, no government would be necessary. James Madison said this quote, and I think it's very prevalent to the movie. I wouldn't necessarily say tons of government is necessary, but in this moment, a little bit more government might have been needed. They ended up passing a few laws after this. They passed the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, which allowed the government to kind of protect the consumer a little bit more. So now the consumer can see financial statements and have a little bit more insight in what they're investing into. This is a picture of Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman had two different viewpoints, the monotonic and pluralist viewpoint. He was a very big proponent of the monotonic viewpoint, which emphasizes that corporations should emphasize on themselves to maximize the shareholders' wealth. This ultimately did not work in 2008. It caused for the downfall of the United States economy. If the pluralist view was used, which talks about acting in the best interest of your shareholders, this would have allowed the economy to keep working. I think a good mixture of both would be very helpful and allows the success for both shareholders and big banks. Next slide. So then we talk about how this has a direct correlation to cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is very prevalent in this movie. The Wall Street culture is all about kind of money at the time, and they weren't looking out for the best interests of the individual investor. They were more talking about what's in the best interest for the banks. So the old saying that money corrupts, I wouldn't necessarily say that all people on Wall Street were corrupt, but there was rating agencies that were doing competition to try to get the best grades and to do the best for themselves and make the most money that they could personally make. This ended up kind of building a bubble with all the CDOs, and this culture of just trying to make as much money and making bad business plays just for yourselves added up. And in the long run, it affected more than just themselves. They made profits in the short run, but it tanked the United States economy and caused millions and millions of people to lose their jobs. And it was a lot. Their consequence of it was very big. Here's some more about cultural relativism. The agents that were selling these houses to these people often sold them to people with the worst credit. There's a scene in the movie where two real estate agents are going and talking about how they like to sell credit to the worst possible, or houses to the worst possible people, with credit wise. Some of these people just could not afford these houses in the long runs. So there was a lot of corruption in that industry as well, that they were just willing to make as much money in the short run for themselves, not realizing that there might be a bubble in the long run. These houses and all these mortgage-backed securities were all bought and then bonded together into CDOs, and that's where the downfall went. This is very similar to cultural relativism on Wall Street, because individuals were out for their own self-interest and making the most money that they can, and not really thinking about what the consequences are for everybody else.
Hey, I'm Jay Ferris. Today I'm going to be talking about cultural relativism in The Big Short and how that connects to the negative stereotypes of Wall Street. So to begin with, the idea of cultural relativism is that a person's belief and practices should be understood based on that person's own culture. So proponents of cultural relativism uh, also tend to argue that the norms and values of one cultures should not be evaluated using the norms and values of another. So therefore, every culture is different from every other culture. Every culture is unique to itself. And so with culture, with I think a huge part of the United States culture is this negative stereotype of Wall Street and the people who work there, the investors, the bankers, the CFOs. And it's a negative connotation. It's a negative stereotype because there's just an overall distrust. And I love the quote from Vinette where he says, Wall Street loves to use confusing terms to make you think only they can do what they can do. So there's just this huge disconnect between Wall Street and their moral beliefs and the everyday Joe who looks at Wall Street like it's some kind of foreign land. They know nothing about it. And so with cultural relativism, it fits into this negative stereotype of Wall Street because people don't really know what is going on, what's morally right, what's morally wrong with Wall Street. They just know that themselves, they distrust them. And so with the bailout that happens, which I'll get into a little bit later, it broadens this distrust of the everyday Joe, people who don't work at Wall Street, and what they think Wall Street does. Next, we have moral subjectivism. Moral subjectivism is that the individual decides what's morally right and what's morally wrong. So, for example, if Joe thinks that it's okay for him to dodge his taxes and find loopholes, and he thinks it's morally right, then to him it's morally right, and therefore it's morally okay. Where we see a lot of moral subjectivism in The Big Short, the thing that stood out to me immediately was this conflict of interest with Evie. Evie works at the SEC, whose job is to monitor and protect shareholders and investors from people cooking the books, people not being totally trustworthy, basically making sure that companies and banks are backing up what they say they have. She works for the SEC, but then she later goes on to admit that she's actually giving her resume out to different investment agencies and banks, which is a complete conflict of interest. And it's how can you work for the person who monitors the banks and then take your resume and apply for the banks? There's a huge conflict of interest there. Second, the failure to investigate in general, the SEC's failure to investigate the CDOs and the mortgages were made up of these bundles. It's just a complete disarray. It's completely untruthful, and to them, their moral subjectivism, they don't look at it as if they're doing anything wrong. Maybe they secretly think that, maybe it's in the back of their head, but they don't care because at the end of the day, they just want to make money. And that's where the moral subjectivism comes into play, because these people, they think they're doing nothing wrong. They think they're doing nothing wrong, and therefore they fail to realize how morally incorrect they are. And finally, we have act utilitarianism. So who benefits, right? So act utilitarianism is a utilitarian theory of ethics which states that a person's act is morally right if and only if it produces the best possible results in that specific situation for the most amount of people. So where this comes into play is the bailout of 2008, when these banks went under for what they did with the CDOs and the mortgages and everything like that. They weren't even held accountable for it. They were able to get a bailout, even though it was totally their fault. A bailout which affected millions of people, both in the U.S. and globally. And so this is a direct violation of act utilitarianism, because the government needed to bail out a few hundred people who worked for the banks, for Merrill Lynch, for this, and that. And in order to do so, they had to take away from millions of people's 401ks, salaries, retirements, which is just absolutely ridiculous and is a complete breach of acutilitarianism, which who benefits the most? And of course, who's to blame? Only one person was actually ever convicted and went to jail. So not only did these bankers get away with making these false synthetic CDOs and building up these false AAA promises that were built on nothing, but when they were caught, they weren't even affected. They weren't even blamed for it, which is absolutely insane. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
All right. So moral nihilism, however you want to pronounce it, is the idea that ethics and moral codes are based entirely on the individual or the culture. There is no set ethical right or wrong for the whole of humanity. It is strictly your own opinion. And in this movie, we can see moral nihilism when Mark is talking to this guy. I'm not sure exactly what his name is, but he's a big guy in the banking industry, does a lot with Merrill Lynch, he likes to add. Very conceited individual. And one of the quotes he says, Mark asks him, he says, so you represent the investors? And he says, well, yes, which seems interesting because with how corrupt this guy is and he's selling all this stuff, it doesn't really benefit the investors as much as he likes to say it does. And then Mark asked him about, are you concerned about the rising default rates, which is like the main tell that they're worried about this whole housing market crash. And he says, I assume no risk for these products myself, Mark. And this is kind of moral nihilistic because, I mean, he represents the shareholder or the investors, and he knows he's not benefiting them, but he also knows that it's benefiting himself. And so he's kind of like, for me, this is good. It's not great for the investors. It's going to hurt them most likely, and he knows that. So his own personal moral code would be whatever's best for himself. And so by saying this, he's saying, I don't care whether my investors are not being benefited because that's not morally wrong to me. But what is morally right is that I am successful and I am benefiting off of these people. And then he says, you think I'm a parasite, Mr. Baum? Apparently society values me very much. In fact, let's do this. I'll tell you how much I'm worth. And then he goes on to say, if you tell me how much you're worth. And this is blatantly moral nihilism because he doesn't care about anybody that is investing in his products. He doesn't care about anybody losing money because of him. All he cares about is his wallet. As you can see, he wants to tell everybody how much he's worth. So he must care a lot about that. If he's making money, then he's morally right. It's benefiting himself. And if he's losing money, he's probably morally wrong. And he probably thinks it's the investor's fault for trusting him, even though, why would they not trust him? So it is a lot of evidence of moral nihilism.
So another aspect of the course that's shown in The Big Short is the idea of deontology, specifically deontology in business. So deontology is the idea that rightness and wrongness of an action depend on the conformity of the moral rule. So in business, this can be argued that deontology would be the idea of obligation to the shareholders and the customers, because the business is only in existence to serve the customers as well as the shareholders. You can see in the top scene that Michael Berry is meeting with two of his investors, and they are upset with his decision to short the housing market because it's always been stable. But he refrains from pulling their money, even though they're adamant about doing so, because he knows that he is right, but he doesn't know why the prices aren't going up. he's just waiting for it to happen, even though he is getting constant pressure from his investors and receiving emails like asking about the premiums that they're paying, which are part of the deal he made with the banks when he shorted the housing market. He knows that he's right, though, and it would be a mistake if they were to pull out their money. He calls it suicide in the movie because he knows that his investors will lose out on billions of dollars if they were to pull out the money and to sell their shares. So basically, he knows his duty. He knows it's basically his fiduciary duty as the manager of the fund to keep their money in the shorts, because he knows it'll maximize as much profit as he can, because it's his job to do so. So yeah, he stays put and he knows his duty. So as you can see throughout the whole presentation, there are a bunch of different aspects of ethics shown in The Big Short: cultural relativism, moral subjectivism, utilitarianism, and moral nihilism, as well as deontology. It does a great job of showing these without actually explaining what's happening. It lets the viewer think about it on their own, as their own thing. And yeah, and these are our citations for our presentation.